so much for joining this live webinar. It's entitled Supporting and Surviving During Uncertain Times. I'm your host for this evening. My name's Andy Langford. If we haven't met before, I know I've met many of you, and it's lovely to see you again on here. I'm Clinical Director for Cruse, and I'll be introducing soon Caroline Lloyd, who's our panelist for this evening. And so Caroline, I'll be introducing, as I say, with a bit more detail in a moment. We've got over 800 people registered this evening, and I just note that we've got nearly 500 on today. So some folk may be joining us, coming on board as we go. Others may download the talk afterwards. So just conscious we might see a few more faces pop up, which will be great. So I just want to start with a bit of housekeeping before we get into the meat of the conversation, really. Once again, if you've just arrived, you'll notice that we've muted your microphones. If for any reason your microphone becomes unmuted, please do just keep an eye on that and make sure it's silenced, just so we can minimize any background noise. We are recording this webinar, and so also if you keep yourself muted, it avoids your voice on the recording. If you wanted to turn your video off, then that makes sure that you don't appear on the recording either. Obviously, if that doesn't concern you, that's absolutely fine, but just leave that up to your own judgments. Our recordings are published on YouTube, so just bear that in mind if you wanted to keep your camera off there. We'll be finishing tonight at 7:30. We won't go any longer. We find that the hour works well in terms of the discussion point. What we'll be doing is, after the introduction, Caroline and I will be talking through the topic, and she'll be sharing her experiences. We'll be doing that for about sort of half an hour, 35 minutes, and then we'll have time for a question and answer section. So in order to keep this manageable, please do type any questions you've got or any thoughts you've got there in that chat section there at the bottom. You'll notice if you click on chat, you'll have an option, your screen will come up and you'll have an option to type something in there. Do keep your questions coming throughout the evening. Now, Beth will pick up those questions and group them into themes, and then she'll send them along to me on my phone, which is sitting by me. So we'll try and get through and address as many of those themes as possible. Although, obviously, I'm sure we won't be able to get to them all. You know, please do put those in and we'll do our very, very best. The other thing just to say is if you don't particularly like seeing the chat, you can exit it just by pressing the chat function again at the bottom of your screen, and then that gets rid of the chat column. So if you find it a bit distracting, just press on that and it will go. Okay, so I think we've got the housekeeping done there. So what I'm going to do is introduce Caroline. So Caroline started volunteering over 30 years ago with terminally ill cancer patients following her first significant bereavement, and has had other significant bereavements since then. But she's changed careers following the death of her 3-year-old nephew in 2005. Now, Caroline was a bereavement volunteer with West Berkshire Cruse for about 6 years, and was also on the Client Services Committee there. So Caroline facilitated support groups in Thames Valley, is a Road Peace Resilience Building Programme facilitator, was a trustee for Road Peace, and is the author of the book Grief Demystified. I'll unashamedly hold that up there, read that myself. Really, really helpful resource I've found. And that's been endorsed by lots of academics and professionals too, as something that's just a very practical manual and an overview for practitioners, but also for bereaved people. So Caroline creates and delivers training. She's currently a researcher and contributor on several projects, and she's in the process of finishing her PhD at Trinity College Dublin. That'll be happening very soon. And And Caroline also writes a number of blogs as well, and we'll be referring to those as we go. So, Caroline, you're really welcome here. It's good to have you this evening.
Thank you so much, Andy, and it's lovely to see you all. And hello to everyone at Cruse. It's just an absolute delight. We can't see everyone. I can't see everybody, but I can see some of the chats coming up and some of the messages coming up from my former colleagues. And I just want to acknowledge that and say hello to them, if you don't mind.
Fantastic. Thank you. So what the session tonight is titled is supporting and surviving during uncertain times. And we're going to be going into that in a little more detail and unpacking that soon. But Caroline, I wanted to ask, if I may, just to sort of ask you at first, what brought you to volunteer for Cruse initially? What was your personal experiences that sort of brought you to the subject, really?
I think that's a really long answer. And my first significant bereavement was in 1988, and my friend died. And at the time I was 22, and I was living in America as well. I was a trainee accountant in America. And in that culture, they have a very different approach to, particularly at that time, to death and dying and bereavement. And there was a real lack of acknowledgement that a friend could be a significant attachment. And a lot of people said to me at the time, "What is wrong with you? He's just a friend." And so I thought there was something wrong with me. So I spent many years thinking there was something wrong with me, and because he was just a friend, not a family member, not a parent. And I really was significantly bereaved. And also, there was a lot of, you need to get over it, or you need to go, Caroline, go to therapy, go fix yourself. There was an awful lot of that at the time. And then I've had several deaths since then, several significant deaths, suicide, pregnancy losses, things like that. And then in 2005, our world imploded when my nephew died. And Charlie was 3 at the time when he was diagnosed with cancer. And what really struck me following that death was the same narrative, but from a different cultural perspective. So there was no acknowledgement from my support system that I could be impacted significantly, because it was my sister's significant attachment. There was no acknowledgement that my mum and I were significantly attached at the time. And I just started reflecting on that and thinking that was a bit strange. And of course, I went back to work about 2 weeks after his funeral. And within a couple of days, I started thinking, well, this just doesn't feel right. People talking about they're still talking about stages, and, you need to go and see somebody. And it was all the same narrative that I'd heard all these years ago in America. So I started researching, and I started reading, and I started writing. And then I realized the book that I found that changed my life at that time, my whole perspective, was this one by Terry Martin and Ken Doker, where they talk about the different grieving styles. And it's a lot more nuanced than we have time for me to talk about at the moment. So I always give a very, very short synopsis in my training or when I'm talking to anybody. And I learned in that book about instrumental grievers. And I learned about the dual process model. And just learning about those two things completely changed my perspective on what I was experiencing. The title of the book is Men Don't Cry, Women Do. And what they set out to research is if there were stereotypical gender grieving patterns. But what they found was much more significant. And it's something that I talk about in my book, and it's something I talk about in my training. And I can't honestly bang on about this enough. And what I found is my grieving style, the way that I exhibit grief, is normal for me. And everyone else that had always told me that I was doing it wrong and I didn't cry enough and I wasn't talking about it and I was repressing and what have you, I learned that that might apply to other people, but it certainly didn't apply to me. And having permission to grieve in my way, which is a very private way, and a very, I do things, I learn. But what it brings me back to, Andy, and what I talk about in my training a lot as well, is how we cope with stresses in normal life. So how we would normally approach any problem or any adverse life event, we shouldn't be expecting somebody to grieve in a different way to that stressor, to the way that they would normally approach other stressors and deal with other stressors. But social discourse does. So if you look on social media, you'll see an awful lot of, you need to express it, you need to talk about it, you need to cry. And if you're not doing all of those things, then you're repressing, and it'll come back, you know, at some point, it'll pop up. And without any consideration of that person and how they would normally deal with normal life events. So for example, if I'm dealing with the boss, and a lot of us have dealt with bosses that are not particularly people that we would want to work for or with. In my situation, I would say to one of my friends, come on, let's go for a coffee, you know, or I would go for a walk, or I would read a book, or I'd go to the library. So I'm going to do the same thing after somebody dies. I'm going to say to my friends, come on, let's go for a coffee, or I'm going to go to the library, find a book on grief, or I'm going to go for a walk. I don't need people telling me that I need to talk about it. And that's what I learned just from that one book. And I thought, I really need to sort of start talking about this. And that's when I started blogging. And it was quite revolutionary. And I started blogging because one of my friends said to me, you should be doing this. You need to, you know, if you want some impact and you want to share that with people. Because at the time I was still working part-time, and then I was a volunteer with Cruse. And she said, my lovely friend, Rosemary said, if you start blogging, you can get that information out. And I did. And the messages I had, literally from all over the world, lots of different countries, was incredible. And that's how that started, Andy. That's really the beginning of how I completely changed careers and started researching and ended up doing this PhD and all the other work I've been doing.
Thanks so much, Caroline. That's a really, you know, you can see how that sort of those personal experiences have led you to this point, you know, through that sort of process, if you will. And it'd be good to unpack a bit a term you used there, which was instrumental grieving. And when we've talked in preparation for this, you've used another term, which was intuitive grieving. And I wondered if you could unpack those for us this evening, just so we can get an overall understanding.
Of course, I'll do that very, very succinctly for you. Intuitive grievers are how we perceive women would grieve. So it's more socially, and it's more emotionally, and it's more about storytelling and retelling stories. And it's about sharing and communicating. It's very emotional. It's what I call emotional grieving. And instrumental grieving is what we would ordinarily associate with like socially determined male roles. So it's more of the, you know, the doing, the arranging, and less of the talking and less of the sharing. And they set out to research whether there was a difference between men and women, and they found that, well, there are gender stereotypes, and the way we're socialized will influence the way that we grieve. So if we're socialized to be open and we're surrounded, and it goes back to what I just said, which is how we deal with stressors prior, you know, before a death occurs, how we deal with other life stressors tends to be how we would naturally deal with a death stressor. We would go to our friends or family or a counsellor, or, you know, walking, or, you know, some people I know garden. you know, and that's how they grieve. Some people go walking, I go walking, and I go walking, and sometimes I'm crying when I'm walking, but no one can see that, you know, and that's what I do. I don't sit with people and cry and talk and share. That's not the way I deal with my stresses. And I don't think that, you know, that should be pathologized. I shouldn't be told I'm doing it wrong because I'm not doing it in a gender stereotypical way. Does that summarize them okay for you?
That's really helpful. And so so what it sounds a little bit like, I remember when we first talked about this, it feels to me like it relates to the dual process model.
Yes.
In some ways, that you have one sort of side of that where you sort of experience this immersion in grief, and you might even feel immobilized by it. And then the other process going on there, which is being mobilized to engage with other things, with life, with the doing, as you described it.
Yeah, absolutely. The dual process model, as I interpret the journal article, is that both the stresses, loss orientation are the death stresses, and restoration orientation are the stresses from having to deal with the adjustments that we have to make in life going forward without our person, and how we oscillate between the two. But also in that paper, and there is another paper after that if anyone's interested, that they've called them, I think it's called The Missing Link, which is a really interesting add-on and another consideration, which we don't have time to go into. But what's in that paper as well, which often people don't realize, is that there is an acknowledgement that sometimes we don't want to be actively doing either or, that sometimes we just want to do nothing and avoid. And that isn't part of the normal process, is not to be actively engaged in grief all the time. That we would deal with the death stresses, we deal with the restoration stresses, all the secondary losses, the adjustments, you know, dealing with companies and funerals and, you know, and everything, accommodating that loss. But there's also within that article, Strobe and Shute are very explicit in that there is an allowance for us to retreat and recuperate and not have to actively engage in one or the other at all times. And again, on social media, in the media, they talk about doing grief work or actively engaging all the time, or you're repressing or avoiding. But Strobe and Shute, in that article, as I interpret it, as saying that is part of the normal process, is not having to engage all the time, because that's exhausting. And we have to have some reprieve from that. You know, it's almost like that is part of the healing, if you want to use that word. And I know some people hate that word, but part of the process is taking a step back, taking a breather, and just sitting and being or avoiding. And that is perfectly normal too.
That's really helpful to sort of knit all that together. I was just noticing in one of the chats that was coming up about access to links to these articles, Caroline. So maybe after this, that would be really helpful. I'm sure for some folk, having that opportunity to read through would be really good and reflect. And of course, one of the things that actually led us to having this conversation this evening was the blog that you wrote and the conversation we had afterwards, really, which is for me talking about how do all these stresses figure in this current context. So in the context of lockdown, in the context of the pandemic, the context of COVID-19, and then alongside that, how are people supposed to cope, told to cope, or feel like they can cope? So can you speak a little bit about, given what you've learned, what does that tell us about what's going on now, really?
I think that's a huge question, and it's something that researchers at the moment are seeking to find answers to. And that in and of itself, presents difficulties because we all have our different perspectives, our different academic disciplines, we're all creating different research designs, we're all interpreting the data in different ways, we'll have different participants, and we have different cultural lenses. So, you know, that's a very complex question. I've read a few of the papers that have been published already, and I echo what Professor Schutt said when I had an email exchange with him, and he said they published a paper, and I echo what he said, which is it's too soon to tell what the medium and long-term impacts are. So it really is premature to predict an increase in negative outcomes, because there is no research design that I'm aware of or have seen evidence of that actually addresses normative adjustments or even a concept called post-traumatic growth. I have not seen any research design that actually looks at those elements. The research that I've seen and the design that I've seen so far and the publications I've seen so far are only solely focused on complicated grief outcomes. And if you think about bereavement, prior to the pandemic, if you look at a bell curve, most grief outcomes sit across the middle in the normative zone. We do adjust normally, whether we have support, counselling, whatever, medication, whatever it is, and whatever that looks like to you. And I'm making no judgments or recommendations of anything. Like I say, we should go to where the bereaved people are, not dictate to them what they need ever. They know what they want, and they know what they perceive that they're not getting or are getting, and they should tell us, they should come to us. Normative grief is a normative outcome, and most of us do adjust normally in whatever way, whatever tools we use, whatever way our coping strategies are. But on the thin ends of a normal distribution curve, and I hope you all know what I'm talking about, on either end are a minority that will experience what is called prolonged grief disorder, also known as persistent complex bereavement disorder, also known as complicated grief, traumatic grief, ad infinitum. And that's a contentious issue because of all the different definitions. There is no consensus on what that is. So, you know, we have to go on the DSM-5 or the ICD-11, and those are the technical manuals that tell us how to diagnose complicated grief. And one of them, the DSM-5, states that complicated prolonged grief disorder is prolonged if it lasts from 6 months or more and is intense and is still intense at 6 months. Now, there are critics of that saying that's too soon to tell if that is actually an abnormal adjustment. But there are advocates for it, like Catherine Sheehan, and she has protocols for treating that. On the other end of the spectrum, the other end of the bell curve, is what's known as post-traumatic growth, Tedeschi and Calhoun. I can send links to all of this. I can send the papers to all of this if anyone's interested. And post-traumatic growth is not just normative adjustment, but it's an increase in positivity, but also, as we interpret the paper for my PhD, my supervisor and I, as we interpret the seminal text on this, we see it as a life-changing experience. Now, I know that, again, going back to Professor Schutt, he published a paper, and I believe it's either 2019, 2020, and they looked at assessing this concept of post-traumatic growth. And I believe that they suggested that there can be an increase in positivity and specifically following a bereavement, if the stressor had been at a medium level, not at a high level. And again, that comes back to perception. But generally speaking, what I'm talking about is, if going back to your original question, language is really important. And if we keep telling people that they're not going to have a normative adjustment, we're creating a social environment where people actually believe that and self-diagnose an abnormal reaction when actually they could be experiencing a very normal reaction, even if we are in an abnormal state of living at the moment. And that's something that researchers are a bit concerned about. And that's something that is flagged up. What we are aware of, and this is from research from somebody called Caroline Pierce, who is a fantastic researcher, and her findings from her study on bereaved people through COVID will be published open access next week. So again, I can send that out. Anyone can find it because it's open access, but I'm happy to send it to you. Caroline found that at the moment, because of the restrictions, bereaved people are saying they don't know where to go for support or help. So in normal times, they'd have their social groups or access to their families or friends, or, you know, a lot of people like to go to Cruse or other charities or counselling because they can see a person and it's that human interaction, but they know where to go for those services, and they can go to their GP for a referral or whatever. And at the moment, because of the restrictions, she was saying she found they don't know where to go to find help at the moment. So that's something that as a service provider or a signposter, as a gatekeeper, that's something that we need to bear in mind. And how do we do that? How do we make sure that bereaved people who are looking for, especially, and I live on my own, so I can completely empathize with people who are bereaved and they're living on their own. You know, we're living in this very isolated environment anyway, especially those of us that have been cocooning as I have. You can't just go outside and ask somebody, you know, where do you go? I'm okay with technology, but I'm not great. You know, I'm middle-aged 54-year-old woman. Technology is still a bit of an alien being to me, and I do my best. But for somebody who isn't used to that, and they're used to somebody coming over, or they're used to having somebody help them to do things, they're going to really struggle in these kinds of situations. And they're the people that really concern me. But I think what we should be doing is promoting more of a positive, we are here for you, we can support you, rather than, you know, you're in isolation, this narrative, well, you're on your own, you're in isolation, you're going to struggle, we're going to have major mental health problems down the road. I just don't think at the moment that's a particularly helpful thing to say. I think a better approach is to say, this is where you can get help, and we can do the best we can in this situation until things open up and things go back to a bit more of a normal environment. I think that's what people need right now, not this constant negative narrative. We can deal with whatever problems occur down the line if they do manifest. And as I say, there's no evidence of that now, and we don't even know that that's going to happen. But what we can do is offer people hope and support. And I think that's where we should be going with our social narrative.
That's really helpful, Caroline. Thank you. I'm conscious there's so much to unpack there. We could spend far more than an hour. Yeah. But that's really, really helpful. One of the things I wanted to touch upon there was just what you said about perception. And so if I can paraphrase, because I want to test my understanding of this, is that I think what I heard you say is effectively that if there's a particular sort of narrative that might be a negative one, then that in turn can affect how we cope with bereavement and how we interpret our grief, and can thus result in more negative outcomes for us in the short or the long term. Is
Yes.
that what? Yeah.
We can literally talk people into having a more negative outcome than they ordinarily would have through the power of suggestion. And let me give you an example of that. And this is a bit random, but anyone who knows me knows that I can be a bit random. When I was 15, I saw a careers advisor once. Only ever happened once, because I'm from, like I said, council estate, Barry Gill. So you saw a careers advisor when you were 15. And I went in, makeup on, skirt hiked up, probably stinking of cigarettes at the time, you know, proper attitude. And he said to me, well, what are you planning on doing when you leave school? And there was an assumption that I would leave school at 16. And I said, well, actually, I'd like to go to university one day, and I'd like to maybe do, and I wasn't very good at maths, but I kind of thought about engineering, just a random. I said, well, maybe engineering or something. And he laughed at me. And he said, A, you're a girl. He said, be realistic. And then he said, somebody like you isn't going to go to university. And that really impacted on me, Andy, because I didn't have a lot of confidence anyway. Being from that kind of background, you know, you weren't expected to excel in academia. You weren't expected to go off to university. You weren't the expectations on us from my environment was very low. You expected to leave school at 16 and go and work in a shop or an office. I did. I left school and went and worked as a receptionist for a company called Cardiff Galvanizers down in Cardiff Docks. And that's what I did. I was the chief tea maker, and I was a really good tea maker, you know, and that was the social expectations placed on me. And that's where I thought my life was going to be, and where my life was just going to develop. So if we place expectations on people that their behavior is meant to be a certain way, or your path is determined for you, the power of suggestion is powerful. If we tell people they can't cope, people told me I couldn't go to university. So I didn't. I never had any expectation I would ever go. I know I'm here now, but it took me an awful long time to get there. As I say, I'm 55 next month. It took me a very long time to get to this point, a long and winding road. But maybe if he'd said, why not? Let me tell you how you can go from this step to that step. And if you need further support or advice, make an appointment and come back and talk to me again. That's what I needed, Andy. I needed somebody to say, I can provide you with information, or I can answer your questions, or I can support you, or I can signpost you. And I think that applies to this situation as well. I'm quite passionate about that. I think if I'm bereaved if I'm bereaved and you're saying, oh, you can't cope, Caroline, you just can't cope. You're going to have complicated grief and you're not going to be able to cope. I'm then going to think, oh my gosh, I'm on my own. I've got no support, no signposting, no information. I know I'm gonna just get worse and depressed and what have you. And it's almost like, but if we tell people, here's the information if you need it, here's the signposting if you need it. So a lot of funeral directors are subscribed to Grief Chat now, professional counselling service. If funeral directors said, here's the details for Cruse if you want to talk to somebody, here's the details for Grief Chat if you want to talk to a counsellor, here's the signposting to Widows and Young, you know, then they've got the leaflet or the contact details. They know there's somebody there who cares about them, Andy. They know there's somebody who's going to be on the end of the phone or in a building or on the internet or whatever it is. And I appreciate things that are mainly online or on the phone. I just think if we tell them they can't cope and we don't give them any tools to cope, what are we expecting the outcome to be?
So actually what we're doing there is setting people up to potentially to fail, really. Or not necessarily fail, because that might be the wrong use of word, but to be in a worse situation than they currently are.
Potentially. I just think there's a danger there. And I think as we are, and as I say, I lived in America, I've lived in Canada, I've lived in Ireland. And I think we British people, as our multicultural, multidimensional, complex society that we have here, I do strongly believe we are very socially responsible. I think we really do care about our communities. I strongly believe that despite the polarization with politics and all kinds of noise out there, I do believe that we as a nation have very strong social values. We value the NHS. We value our support systems. The neighbours around here have just been incredible to each other. And I see this evidenced over and over again, whatever, we might see on the news or whatever. I do strongly believe that we care about our communities and we care about our neighbours. And so I think that in providing, so what I'm saying is, I don't think it's that we don't care about the bereaved. I think we just maybe need to refocus and shift our narratives to, we are here for you, we will support you, and there are nets, there is a safety net in place within our society to catch you if you're falling and if you need it, and this is where you can find it.
So actually, if I can paraphrase again, one of the main takeaway messages is for us as bereavement volunteers, staff in Cruse, other professionals working with bereaved people, is actually to communicate that we or others are here for you, and that there are different ways of seeking support, and that there's access available. I mean, one of the things that I was just so impressed with was how, and during when the pandemic started back around this time last year, the amount of local Cruse services that reached out to their local communities to say, we're here for you, was absolutely astounding. And actually the organisation made lots of connections with things like funeral homes, did mass mail shots and things like that. And so it may for us also be about how we're making sure that we're connecting with our communities, that we're all connecting together so that people do know where to come when they need support.
Yeah, absolutely. But and I also think that we can, and some of us are skilled listeners, some of us are trained professionals. I think that we can embody we embody Roger's core conditions, don't we? We embody empathy and we embody going to where they're at. And I think in demonstrating that in our normal lives with people around us, and I know a lot of us are remotely connected at the moment as opposed to personally connected per se, if we embody that and if we share that with our friends and family, and I think if we're open about how we support bereaved people, that we can spread that knowledge, and we can share that. We can say, well, what do you think you need? Rather than saying, I think you need that. If we just change that language, and another issue, and I'm going off slightly off tangent now, we have to address this. I do think we're in a dangerous situation at the moment where deaths are being perceived to be preventable, is leading into an undercurrent of no one ever dies, and that's something we need to be mindful of as well, is that death is normal and natural, and we take the politics out of dying. And I think it was, and one other point I'd like to make on that subject, I think it was in Catherine Mannix's book where she talks about how a lot of people who are dying wait until their loved one leaves the room before they do actually die, because it's almost like if they're not there, they can slip away, because while they're watchfully waiting, they don't feel like they have permission to go. So, you know, we have these counter narratives about preventing death and death in hospital and people dying on their own. But I think if we acknowledge that in normal life, people do die in hospital, and that's okay. And people do die on their own, and that's okay too, whether they're at home or whether they're in hospitals. And yes, it might not be. And Erica Borgstrom actually wrote a lovely article. It's on the Open University website. She wrote a lovely article questioning what is a good death. You know, who are we to decide what a good death is? And that's something I would recommend that is read too, because if we're weaving in narratives about supporting bereaved people and going to where they're at and being empathic and supporting them in a way that they want, we also need to support them in a narrative that death and dying is normal, because not all deaths are COVID-related deaths. We still have normal deaths, we still have cancer deaths, heart attacks, suicides, escalating suicides, I'm hearing, although I don't know if that's been supported by statistics yet. But we still have, you know, one of my neighbours died a couple of weeks ago, and that was a normal death, you know. But I'm worried that normal deaths are kind of being sidelined, and potentially we're disenfranchising those grievers while all the attention is focused on COVID deaths.
So there's something very sort of strong there about being aware as a volunteer, as a staff member for Cruse, or a practitioner working with bereaved people, a supporter, someone in our local communities, that there's someone maybe carrying what we define as a hierarchy of grief, that there may be something present for them. We don't of course endorse that, but that might be present for them.
Yes.
But one of the things I've been doing, just to make people aware as well, as we've been talking, I've been looking through the chat and picking up some of the themes in my questioning. So please be assured I haven't ignored it. But what I wanted to do is just refer to a couple of particular themes that are coming through the chat now, Caroline. So it might seem like a little bit of a gear crunch, but I want to make sure that we look at a couple of elements that are really coming through strongly. One of the things that people seem to be sort of searching for is the understanding of, well, we talked a little bit about complex grief and all those other definitions and diagnoses. But actually, is there any value to a diagnosis, or isn't there?
Do you know, I think that's there is no consensus on that, Andy. From the literature that I've read, from the people that I've talked to, and you know, and I've seen, you know, I was at the conference in 2019, and I've witnessed and been a part of conversations with people who are experts, and I have to, you know, in your Eventbrite notification, I mean, I'm delighted to be called an expert, but I certainly wouldn't self-identify as that. I just want to put that out there. I never called myself that. I just want to make that perfectly clear. At the 2019 conference, there were conversations on this subject with the people that are experts, established experts, and there really was no consensus, Andy. So, you know, if they can't agree, who, you know, I really have nothing to say on that.
Well, and I think one of the things I've certainly encountered working at Cruse, and as a supervisor on the helpline myself, is that sometimes people do come to our organisation, to our services, saying they've been diagnosed with something, saying that another professional has said they have complex grief, or that they have a particular, I mean, obviously a number set of diagnoses, but we're referring specifically to grief. Any sort of thoughts about how we as supporters might best interact with that?
I would refer to Catherine Newsom's. I do have it to hand. So Henk very kindly sent me Catherine Newsom's, and I will send a link to send further information on this. Catherine Newsom's PhD was looking at, it was a wonderful project that involved Cruse volunteers in Scotland, and it was supervised by Henk and I believe Margaret Strobe, although I could be corrected on that. And the participants were Cruse clients, and the triangulation was beautiful between Scotland and the Netherlands. And they looked at providing effective bereavement support targeted to the needs of bereaved people. And what she's recommending in here, and this is a beautiful piece of research, and because it's evidential, and the model that's proposed is so beautiful. It's called a stepped care model of bereavement care, and it's like a pyramid. So if you imagine the bottom layer, and it's not steps, it is a fluid model of a pyramid. The bottom layer would be society. And this is what we've been talking about, the narratives. What do we tell people? How do we support them? And we know from other research, and I keep referencing the research heavily because this is evidence. This isn't my opinion. This is what we know from bereaved people. So we know from Sherman Lee that bereaved people within their communities, then we call it the microsystem, the face-to-face contacts, their friends, their family, their colleagues, their work colleagues. There are three things that they're looking for. And one of them is they don't want to be told how to feel or how to react or how to grieve, because that can harm them. And that's what I'm talking about. That happened to me many times, and it was harmful. Another thing that they're looking for is availability. They want their friends and their family to be available. Like I said, if I'm having a problem with my boss in work, I'm going to ask one of my friends to meet me for a coffee. So if somebody's died, I want to be able to ask that friend to meet me for a coffee. That's availability. And then the other one would be being emotionally insensitive. And as you know, there's a whole chapter in my book on that, about what we don't say. You don't say, and I'm preaching to the converted here, so I'm not going to go through them because you are all aware of them. So we want people to be more sensitive in their language. So that would be the bottom layer of the pyramid, is what I call grief literacy. Don't tell people what to do and how to do it, ask them. Be available. You know, if you normally text your friend every day, carry on texting your friends every day. Don't just stop texting them because somebody dies, and act appropriately. So, and then of course we go up the pyramid to skilled listener and advanced skilled listeners. Many of Cruse volunteers, when I was there, were skilled listeners or advanced skilled listeners. And then as we go up, and it is a fluid upward motion, because we know a lot of Cruse volunteers are qualified counsellors and other qualified counsellors and other organisations or independent ones, then we would move up. And then we would signpost upwards. And then at the top of the pyramids are obviously the specialists, the psychologists, the psychiatrists, you know, and those people who have very specialist skills and are doctors. And that's what they're advocating for here, is that we have a model of care. So we as a community are there and available and sensitive and literate to our friends, our family, our neighbours. But if for any reason, because we all know not there for us, particularly when we need them, sometimes they don't know what to do and they disappear. I mean, that certainly happened to me as well. So then where would we go? We'd go to a skilled listener, wouldn't we? I would then go to Cruse and say, can I talk to somebody? And some people are very private and they don't want to talk to their family and friends about how they're feeling, what they're dealing with, or they might be having. And again, I've had Cruse clients come in because they want to talk to somebody, because they can't talk to their family or friends, because the problem is with the family or the friends, or they're arguing over the funeral, post-funeral, what happens at the funeral. We've all had those clients. And then, you know, if they need further, I've certainly referred one client in particular. She went to a psychologist because there were issues that went right back to childhood that her and her sister needed help with. And I talked to my supervisor about that, and we determined the best person to signpost that client to. And that's what your supervisor is there for. You know, we have to acknowledge our limitations, what we can do, and where our limitations are, and when we need to signpost on to to somebody who's more specialised than us, has different skills to us. And so that's what I would be advocating, because it is evidential.
That's really, really helpful, Caroline. Thank you. I'm going to start drawing us to a close now, because I'm very conscious of time. I'm also conscious that without even trying, we could easily slip into a part 2 of the conversation, and that may well be something we do. But it feels for me like we've sort of scratched the surface. There's lots more to talk about. So what I just wanted to sort of bring out there was really what you're talking about there, Caroline, that model of that stepped care, and also about the fluidity of it, that there needs to be a sense of, as a bereaved person, I can engage with what I need to at different points, but actually I don't get stuck at one part of the pyramid and I can't go up or down. Actually, I can engage with what I need to when I need to, bearing in mind that I might need one thing a week after the death of someone close. I might need a different thing 6 months after, and I might need something else a year after, and so forth. There might be different things at different times.
Exactly.
Super. So thank you so much.